I want to say Gimme Gwetch to Brian for that song. I've been super nervous all day today about this presentation. There are a lot of people in this audience who I have deep respect and admiration for, so forgive me if I stumble a little bit. Also, Gimme Gwetch for the opportunity to allow me to Northwest Indian College for the opportunity to share with you what is going on in Tacoma on the Salish Sea. And I'm also grateful to be here to do what Vine Deloria would say, to talk about things that are important. I'm going to read, otherwise I'll talk your ears off and it'll probably be boring as well. I'm part of a growing community of people who are fighting against fossil fuel projects at the Port of Tacoma. Right now, a liquefied natural gas plant, which is also fracked gas, is being planned for the Blair Waterway. Mostly we're fighting for the Salish Sea. Greg Cajete, in his book Native Science, discusses how northeastern tribes historically worked with oil. He also discusses their development of oil pits and how the tribes in California use petroleum as well. He doesn't draw a direct relation to oil as a relative in this book, but I think it's not too big of a leap in logic to believe that at least oil and petroleum were respected in these societies. In my tradition, as Anishinabekwe, water, nibe, is a relative to be honored and respected. The universal laws that acknowledge water, the land, the trees, as part of the family of life on this planet are immutable. Many in modern society have forgotten this fact. Dr. Robin Wall Kimmerer invokes us to remember that the land holds the memories and the possibility of regeneration. Since the first environmental law was forged in 1899, agencies have been formed, funded, and given authority to manage and administer for the preservation and protection of the land, air, and waters across the country. Also, since that time, agency and industry have fought bitter fights in the courts at the expense of the people, the water, the land, the air, and our other relatives. Rare is the occasion where we have fought from a position where nature would have equal standing in those battles. Is our country so lost in the throes of crass capitalism, or what I like to call free market colonialism, that we are unwilling to change this course? The commodification of oil and water have contributed to the broken relationships between human and our more than human relatives, and it is imperative to increase the efforts to course correct. To be clear, not all our laws or agencies have failed us. There have been good things that have come out of movements, legislation, and policy making. There are public agencies who work a certain kind of alchemy, balancing the administration part of environmental law and policy with the politics of environmental law and policy, so that application is as fair and balanced as possible. When I'm fighting industry and agency in my spare time, because I also have a full-time job, I am considering two questions pertaining to the need for granting standing. One, why do we need to push for the courts to recognize our relatives as valid plaintiffs? And two, how do we accomplish this for our relatives? To address the first question of why, besides what we arguably could say are the most evident reasons, which are the moral and ethical imperative for protection of and honoring the reciprocal relationship with our relatives, the reality is that legislation and administrative policies are often at odds with each other. Industry has figured out how to manipulate loopholes, and chasing that ROI, return on investment, are effectively practicing what is known as segmentation in the planning and permitting processes. Another reason why, and this points to what Vine Deloria said in chapter 10 of the Legal Universe, is how industry does a really good job of smearing people who want to stand up for our relatives by calling them radicals or terrorists. And this was evident at Standing Rock. Industry has also become extremely proficient at greenwashing their business models, and they've ingratiated themselves as important stakeholders in the offices of administrators, while the voices of the citizens and nature are drowned out. Here are some examples that inform my work. This is what I've observed taking place in our battles, not just against LNG. We also fought against methanol, and there are more projects coming, we know, on the horizon. Let's see. Sorry, I lost my way. So the first thing is, what we've encountered is there's no meaningful notification in these processes. Tacoma Title 13 Municipal Land Use Code requires notification of anyone living within 400 feet of a planned project. No one lives within 400 feet of this project. So they have obeyed the letter of the law, but not the spirit of the law. And because they obeyed the letter of the law and were able to say that they notified people that they had gotten buy-in, basically. But it made us wonder what kind of project actually where would you only want to notify people living within 400 feet of any kind of a project? Most of these types of projects, the impact extends way beyond 400 feet. So I also want to talk about the environmental impact statement under the State Environmental Protection Act. What we found on this project is that these reviews happen independent of any other projects, so they're judged independently and not with regard to any other projects that are in proximity of it. The City of Tacoma claimed lead agency status on this, stating that they had priority in the review since they alone knew what was best for the City of Tacoma. We're trying to determine right now if we have any route for a judicial appeal to that. We've begged them for over a year for a supplemental environmental impact statement. They've refused, and what we've run into is where the City of Tacoma and the Department of Ecology are basically pointing at each other, saying they're responsible for launching the supplemental environmental impact statement. The project has changed significantly since it first was granted approval under the EIS. The first EIS, final EIS, I know that sounded contradictory, but the final EIS was only for a 1 million gallon tank, but now PSC wants to do an 8 million gallon tank. So even though they've increased the scope of the project, neither City of Tacoma nor Department of Ecology want to look at it again and do a supplemental environmental impact statement. So these are just a couple of examples of the things that we've run into, trying to stand up for the Salish Sea and prevent the infusion of fossil fuel projects. So the second question is, how do we attain standing for our relatives in a court of law? Almost made it. As a weary land and water defender whose work is minimal compared to others, I don't do as much as so many other people do. It's hard to not lose faith. If we're unable to persuade agencies and leaders to consider the impacts of industry on human health, it seems highly unlikely that adding our relatives to the list of potential defendants is going to create change. However, it is incredibly encouraging to see the changes and the successes of indigenous communities are making in India with regard to the Ganges River and the Yamuna River, the Wurundjeri River in New Zealand, and I'm incredibly inspired by the fact that the Ho-Chunk are moving towards putting an amendment to their constitution to grant those rights to nature. And we have deep gratitude for those who are laying that foundation. Christopher Stone, in his book, Should Trees Have Standing, highlights that one of the struggles towards moving towards this paradigm is the lack of cases in the courts. So few cases have been brought that it's difficult to gain any momentum in the courts when case law is that minimal. And I want to stress, it should not fall solely on indigenous communities to make sure that we have enough case law to rely on. So, at the risk of sounding fatalistic, I am weary, but I'm hopeful. It truly feels like a tipping point is around the corner. There's a lot of work ahead of us. There are so many different angles to approach, but I know that many hands will make light of the work. And I thought about how to talk about some of the approaches that we're using with regard to specific codes and languages written into RCWs and things like that, but there's so many different ways to approach that, and I didn't want to get too technical about it right here. Plus, I'm not that well versed at it. But here are the key principles that I use to inform my work and that I use to try and encourage my community and those who get weary along the way. I will continue to seek allies, resources, and pathways to bring cases to the courts. I will remember to pay attention. It is not unusual to be misled and confounded by the very representatives that are believed to be providing direction for how to change the broken policies and legislation. I will remember that agency can only work within a framework crafted and supported by legislation. The legislators need to be led by us. I will keep using language that honors the relatives, the water, the trees, even oil. I will keep modeling how to restore the reciprocal relationship and to learn from the models of collaboration and symbiosis that exist in the more than human communities, to remember the symbiotic relationship between clams and salmon, between mussels and lamprey, between lichen and mosses. I will remember Billy Frank Jr.'s words, especially to tell the truth. I will fight like Hazel Wolf with dignity and grace. I will be very strategic like Waduna the Duke. I remember that this action to gain standing for our relatives requires sustained effort in order to be successful, even when it's wearying. I will spend time at the water and with the trees and do everything to restore that relationship. Environmental law and policy without spirit are ineffective. Kehete says that native science is about context and relationship. I will remind our law and policymakers that Nive is a relative, not a resource. I believe it is an ethical and moral act to acknowledge that our relatives deserve respect and gratitude and should be granted standing in every decision. Miigwech, thank you.